Oh, to heck with that. I'm going to take that off. You can't hear me. Greetings, dear listeners. Hope you're all doing well. As many of you know, I'm a recovering librarian. So books have been a big, important part of my life. Well, the first adult book that I ever bought, and by adult I mean it didn't have any pictures, it was just words. The first adult book I ever bought was a paperback called Batman versus 3 Villains of Doom. Batman versus 3 Villains of Doom. It was 144 pages, and I loved that book. It took me a couple of days to read, but I couldn't put it down. And when I finished it, I gave it to one of my buddies to read, and he brought it back to me the next day and said, "This book is stupid. Batman couldn't do all that stuff. It's impossible." Well, I ask you, some people, right? Some people. And where is that guy now, I'd like to know. Actually, I do know. He's rich and famous, but oh well. But the second paperback that I bought was this little book that I have in my hand, The Weirdest People in the World. And no, this isn't my original copy. I lost that one, but I found this one in a used bookstore, and it's about the same condition as my copy would have been. So, The Weirdest People in the World by C.B. Colby. So I'm going to read from the back jacket. Strange, weird, fantastic, but absolutely true. Here are stories of the strangest people and events ever witnessed by human eyes. They may startle you, shock you, perhaps even make you tremble with fear. But one thing is sure, after reading this book, you will never be able to look at the world around you the same way again. And I guess that's true enough, because this is a book that sparked my interest in weird stories. It also says on the back here, guaranteed. If this book does not give you full reading satisfaction, mail it back to Popular Library Incorporated, 355 Lexington Avenue, New York, New York, to receive a complete refund of your money. I wonder what would happen if I did that. Not that I'm going to give up this classic for my 50-cent refund. But this book has a number of great, supposedly weird, true, scary stories, such as, he walked down a country lane and straight into another century. Safe in her parlor, she suddenly turned into devouring flame. From a watery grave, this woman rose to claim her child. Drowning, he was saved by a miracle and found himself suspended 50 feet in the air. The man who was destroyed by his own amazing invention. Now, C.B. Colby was a professional writer. He wrote a lot of books, mainly for younger readers, about military history and nature, but he also must have had a newspaper column where he wrote about weird happenings, because most of the stories in this book are about the right length for a newspaper column. And it's the same with the stories in this other collection by C.B. Colby, Strangely Enough, which is, again, it's got some great stories in it. Now, C.B. Colby died in 1977, but since his death, his works have been repackaged. His weird tales have been repackaged in a whole series of other paperbacks, like this one from our library collection, Scary Stories for Halloween Nights. So, like Shakespeare, C.B. Colby lives on. But getting back to the weirdest people in the world, the best story in this book, the biggest piss cutter of them all, was this one. The boy who vanished, pulled up into the sky. The strange story of Oliver Larch. It was Christmas Eve in 1889 on a farm near South Bend, Indiana. The The Larch family were entertaining a number of guests, including the minister and his wife, a circuit court judge from South Bend, and a prominent Chicago attorney. After dinner, the family and their friends gathered around the organ in the front parlor to sing Christmas carols, while Mrs. Larch, who was the church organist, played for them. Everyone, that is, except 11-year-old Oliver, who was in the kitchen busily popping popcorn on the stove. Now, at that point, Mr. Larch, his father, noticed that their bucket of fresh drinking water had run low. So he asked Oliver to quickly go outside, go to the well, and draw a fresh bucket of water. This was 1889, remember, where they didn't have the amenities and conveniences we have today, particularly on the farm. But don't worry, I'm not going to go into the bathroom arrangements at all. Anyways, about 5 or 6 inches of snow had fallen that day. So Oliver put on his hat, he put on his overcoat, he put on his muffler, he put on his gloves, he put on galoshes, because this was 1889 after all, and he stepped out the back door with the empty bucket and walked into oblivion. He'd only been gone about 10 seconds when the adults heard him screaming from the backyard, and Mr. Larch grabbed a lantern and went racing out with the other men to see what on earth had happened. And because of the snow, they were able to follow easily Oliver's footprints, and they ran about 75 feet, about halfway to the well, where they just stopped. They could easily follow the footprints in the newly fallen snow. And after about 75 feet, they just stopped. Stopped dead. Like, ended. There were no other footprints around, no signs of a scuffle. The only thing that was visible was the water bucket, which was lying about 15 feet to the right of the footprints, of the trail of footprints, as if it had been thrown there or dropped from above. And as they stood there, they could hear Oliver's cries. "Mother! Father! Help! Help! They've got me! They've got me!" But the cries seemed to be coming from the darkness overhead, as if Oliver had been lifted or levitated into the night sky. And as they stood there, his cries became fainter and fainter and fainter until they could be heard no more. And Oliver Larch was never seen again in this world, although for weeks afterwards, people outside at night could claim that they could hear him crying from the dark sky above, "Mother! Father! Help! Help! They've got me! They've got me!" So, dear listeners, what do you think happened to Oliver? Who do you think they were? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And I should mention there is actually a considerable backstory to the saga of Oliver Larch. It's too convoluted and complicated for me to get into here, but if you're really interested and would be interested in a longer video exploring that backstory, let me know that in the comments as well below. And one more thing. I have quite a few of these paperback collections of weird and strange stories in the Warren S. James Memorial Library. So let me know if you would be interested as well in more videos in this kind of format, sharing some of the weird stories from my collection. So that's 3 things to do. You can do all 3 or just one, but they are: what do you think happened to Oliver Larch? Who were they? 2, would you be interested in a longer video exploring the backstory of the Oliver Larch saga? And 3, Would you be interested in more weird tales from my collection of weird paranormal paperbacks? Let me know your thoughts to any or all of these in the comments below. So, dear listeners, stay safe, stay subscribed, ring that bell so you don't miss any upcoming videos, and feel free to share this video or any of my videos with anyone you please. If this is your first visit to my channel, my name is Warren, and I write and tell original ghost stories and original horror stories featuring cryptids such as the night floaters, werewolves, and the black-eyed children. So again, please consider subscribing. And may I say, a Merry Christmas to all, and to all till midnight. Cheers. Sorry, I forgot I had this on. No, that was a joke. That was actually a gag.
All right, I turned my phone off, so I shouldn't get any noise.
Okay.
It's rolling, so you just keep going. We'll cut this out.
Okay. It was Christmas Eve, 1889, in South Bend, Indiana. The Larch family were entertaining guests, including a circuit court judge and his wife, plus a lawyer from Chicago. Dinner over, they had all gathered around the organ to sing Christmas carols, while Mrs. Larch, the local church organist, played for them. 11-year-old Oliver was making popcorn on the stove when his father noticed the bucket of drinking water was almost empty and asked Oliver to go to the well and draw some more. Oliver put on his overcoat and galoshes. It was 1889 after all, and grabbed the bucket and headed out through the back door. No doubt he was thirsty from all the popcorn. Oliver was only gone about 10 seconds when the adults around the organ heard his terrified screams. Mr. Larch grabbed a lantern as the adults all hurried outside. There was 5 or 6 inches of snow on the ground, so they could easily follow Oliver's footprints, which were clearly visible for some 75 feet, halfway to the well, where they stopped. Dead. There were no other footprints, no signs of a struggle, no nothing. The metal bucket was found 15 feet from the line of footsteps, as if it had been dropped from above. Later, the metal handle was found to be fused, as if exposed to extreme heat. The searchers could hear cries, "Help, Mother! Help, Father! Help me! Help me! They've got me! They've got me!" But the cries seemed to be coming from the darkness overhead, as if Oliver had been levitated into the night sky. And Oliver Larch was never seen again, but for weeks after, his cries for help were heard coming from above, from the sky. This was a piss-cutter story I read in C.B. Colby's The Weirdest People in the World, back in 1965, and I never forgot it. But the saga of Oliver Larch has an equally interesting backstory. The Larch story had previously appeared back in 1956 in Strangest of All, by Frank Edwards, a writer who specialized in accounts of paranormal events. When I was in grade 7, a buddy of mine loaned me a hardcover copy of Edwards' first book, Stranger Than Science, and I stayed up half the night reading it. Apparently, the story of Oliver Larch also appeared in The Case for the UFO by Morris K. Jessup, another book I read back in the day. But the story didn't originate with Morris K. Jessup or Frank Edwards. In the September 1950 edition of Fate magazine, a magazine devoted to accounts of the paranormal, writer Joseph Rosenberger penned a very similar story of a mysterious disappearance, but this time the victim was a 20-year-old Oliver Larch, who vanished from South Bend, Indiana on Christmas Eve 1890. 6 years later, Frank Edwards' account changed Oliver from a Lurch to a Larch, his age from 20 to 11, and the year from 1890 to 1889. According to author Kevin Randall, Morris K. Jessup claimed in The Case for the UFO that the South Bend, Indiana Police Department had files relating to the disappearance of Oliver Larch/Lurch. So Randall phoned the police department only to learn that their records only went back to 1920. But a call to the local newspaper, the South Bend Tribune, was more successful and yielded a number of clippings from the 50s and 60s, including one featuring an interview with members of the Larch family who still lived in the area. They said the story simply wasn't true. Even worse, it appears the weather for Christmas Eve in both 1889 and 90 featured temperatures in the 50s and 60s Fahrenheit, so forget about 6 inches of snow on the ground. And hey, I could use those temperatures around here in Canada at Christmas time. So where did this story come from? Rosenberger claimed to have made the whole thing up, but further research by authors Theo Pagmans and Chris Aubeck in the Fortean Times revealed that the story had been kicking around for years, and they ultimately connected it to another man who disappeared, Ambrose Bierce. For those of you unfamiliar with the name, Ambrose Bierce was an American writer of Civil War stories. He was a Union Army veteran and of weird fiction. His most famous story is An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Owl Creek Bridge. If you've never read him, I encourage you to do so. Bierce's nickname was Bitter Bierce, and to say he was cynical and cantankerous is an understatement. After all, among his publications was The Devil's Dictionary. Bierce himself disappeared under mysterious circumstances in 1914, when, at the age of 72, he went to Mexico to interview Pancho Villa and was never heard from again. Who knows? Perhaps he's wandering out there still. In 1888, Bierce wrote an article called Whither? Some Strange Instances of Mysterious Disappearance, which was published in the October 14th edition of the San Francisco Examiner, and later in his 1893 collection, Can Such Things Be? The article featured accounts of 3 supposedly true disappearances. The one that concerns us is Charles Ashmore's Trail. It reads, The family of Christian Ashmore consisted of his wife, his mother, 2 grown daughters, and a son of 16 years. They lived in Troy, New York, were well-to-do, respectable persons and had many friends, some of whom, reading these lines, will doubtless learn for the first time the extraordinary fate of the young man. From Troy, the Ashmores moved in 1871 or 1872 to Richmond, Indiana, and a year or two later to the vicinity of Quincy, Illinois, where Mr. Ashmore bought a farm and lived on it. At some little distance from the farmhouse was a spring with a constant flow of clear, cold water, whence the family derived its supply for domestic use at all seasons. On the evening of the 9th of November in 1878, at about 9 o'clock, young Charles Ashmore left the family circle around the hearth, took a tin bucket, and started towards the spring. As he did not return, the family became uneasy, and going to the door by which he had left the house, his father called without receiving an answer. He then lighted a lantern, and with the eldest daughter, Martha, who insisted on accompanying him, went in search. A light snow had fallen, obliterating the path, but making the young man's trail conspicuous. Each footprint was plainly defined. After going a little more than halfway, perhaps 75 yards, the father, who was in advance, halted, and elevating his lantern, stood peering intently into the darkness ahead. "What is the matter, father?" the girl asked. This was the matter. The trail of the young man had abruptly ended, and all beyond was smooth, unbroken snow. The last footprints were as conspicuous as any in the line. The very nail marks were distinctly visible. Mr. Ashmore looked upward, shading his eyes with his hat, held between them and the lantern. The stars were shining. There was not a cloud in the sky. He was denied the explanation which had suggested itself, doubtful as it would have been. A new snowfall with a limit so plainly defined. Taking a wide circuit round the ultimate tracks, so as to leave them undisturbed for further examination, the man proceeded to the spring, the girl following, weak and terrified. Neither had spoken a word of what both had observed. The spring was covered with ice, hours old. Returning to the house, they noted the appearance of the snow on both sides of the trail its entire length. No tracks led away from it. The morning light showed nothing more. Smooth, spotless, unbroken, the shallow snow lay everywhere. 4 days later, the grief-stricken mother herself went to the spring for water. She came back and related that in passing the spot where the footprints had ended, she had heard the voice of her son and had been eagerly calling to him, wandering about the place, as she had fancied the voice to be now in one direction, now in another, until she was exhausted with fatigue and emotion. Questioned as to what the voice had said, she was unable to tell, yet averred that the words were perfectly distinct. In a moment, the entire family was at the place, but nothing was heard, and the voice was believed to be a hallucination caused by the mother's great anxiety and her disordered nerves. But for months afterward, at irregular intervals of a few days, the voice was heard by the several members of the family and by others. All declared it unmistakably the voice of Charles Ashmore. All agreed that it seemed to come from a great distance, faintly, yet with entire distinctness of articulation, yet none could determine its direction, nor repeat its words. The intervals of silence grew longer and longer, the voice fainter and farther, and by midsummer it was heard no more. If anybody knows the fate of Charles Ashmore, it is probably his mother. She is dead. Mysterious Disappearances by Ambrose Bierce, originally published in the San Francisco Examiner on October 14th, 1888. 1. The difficulty of crossing a field. One morning in July 1854, a planter named Williamson, living 6 miles from Selma, Alabama, was sitting with his wife and a child on the veranda of his dwelling. Immediately in front of the house was a lawn, perhaps 50 yards in extent, between the house and public road, or, as it was called, the pike. Beyond this road lay a close-cropped pasture of some 10 acres, level and without a tree, rock, or any natural or artificial object on its surface. At the time, there was not even a domestic animal in the field. In another field, beyond the pasture, a dozen slaves were at work under an overseer. Throwing away the stump of a cigar, the planter rose, saying, "I forgot to tell Andrew about those horses." Andrew was the overseer. Williamson strolled leisurely down the gravel walk, plucking a flower as he went, passed across the road and into the pasture, pausing a moment as he closed the gate leading into it to greet a passing neighbor, Armour Wren, who lived on an adjoining plantation. Mr. Wren was in an open carriage with his son James, a lad of 13. When he had driven some 200 yards from the point of meeting, Mr. Wren said to his son, "I forgot to tell Mr. Williamson about those horses." Mr. Wren had sold to Mr. Williamson some horses, which were to have been sent for that day, but for some reason not now remembered, it would be inconvenient to deliver them until the morrow. The coachman was directed to drive back, and as the vehicle turned, Williamson was seen by all three, walking leisurely across the pasture. At that moment, one of the coach horses stumbled and came near falling. It had no more than fairly recovered itself when James Wren cried, "Why, father, what has become of Mr. Williamson?" It is not the purpose of this narrative to answer that question. Mr. Wren's strange account of the matter, given under oath in the course of legal proceedings relating to the Williamson estate, here follows. My son's exclamation caused me to look towards the spot where I had seen the deceased an instant before, but he was not there, nor was he anywhere visible. I cannot say that at the moment I was greatly startled or realized the gravity of the occurrence, although I thought it singular. My son, however, was greatly astonished and kept repeating his question in different forms until we arrived at the gate. My coachman, Sam, was similarly affected, even in a greater degree, but I reckon more by my son's manner than by anything he had himself observed. As we got out of the carriage at the gate of the field, and while Sam was tying the team to the fence, Mrs. Williamson, with her child in her arms, and followed by several servants, came running down the walk in great excitement, crying, "He is gone! He is gone! Oh God! What an awful thing! And many other such exclamations, which I do not distinctly recollect. I got from them the impression that they related to something more than the mere disappearance of her husband, even if that had occurred before her eyes. Her manner was wild, but not more so, I think, than was natural under the circumstances. I have no reason to think she had, at that time, lost her mind. I have never since seen nor heard of Mr. Williamson. This testimony, as might have been expected, was corroborated in almost every particular by the only other eyewitness, if that is the proper term, the lad James. Mrs. Williamson had lost her reason, and the servants were, of course, not competent to testify. The boy James Wren had declared at first that he saw the disappearance, but there is nothing of this in his testimony given in court. None of the field hands working in the field to which Williamson was going had seen him at all, and the most rigorous search of the entire plantation and adjoining country failed to provide a clue. The most monstrous and grotesque fictions were current in that part of the state for many years, and probably are to this day, but what has been here related is all that is certainly known of the matter. The courts decided that Williamson was dead, and his estate was distributed according to law. 2. An unfinished race. James Byrne Warson was a shoemaker who lived in Leamington, Warwickshire, England. He had a little shop in one of the byways leading off the road to Warwick. In his humble sphere, he was esteemed an honest man, although, like many of his class in English towns, he was somewhat addicted to drink. When in liquor, he would make foolish wagers. On one of these too frequent occasions, he was boasting of his prowess as a pedestrian and athlete, and the outcome was a match against nature. For a stake of 1 sovereign, he undertook to run all the way to Coventry and back, a distance of something more than 40 miles. This was on the 3rd day of September in 1873. He set out at once. The man with whom he had made the bet, whose name is not remembered, accompanied by Barham Wise, a linen draper, and Hammerson Burns, a photographer, I think, following in a light cart or wagon. For several miles, Warson went on very well, at an easy gait, without apparent fatigue, for he had really great powers of endurance, and was not sufficiently intoxicated to enfeeble them. The 3 men in the wagon kept a short distance in the rear, giving him occasional friendly chaff or encouragement as the spirit moved them. Suddenly, in the very middle of the road, not a dozen yards from them, and with their eyes full upon him, the man seemed to stumble, pitched headlong forward, uttered a terrible cry, and vanished. He did not fall to the earth. He vanished before touching it. No trace of him was ever discovered. After remaining at or about the spot for some time, with aimless irresolution, the 3 men returned to Leamington, told their astonishing story, and were afterward taken into custody. But they were of good standing, had always been considered truthful, were sober at the time of the occurrence, and nothing ever transpired to discredit their sworn account of their extraordinary adventure, concerning the truth of which, nevertheless, public opinion was divided throughout the United Kingdom. If they had something to conceal, Their choice of means is certainly one of the most amazing ever made by sane human beings. So what do you think, dear listeners? What happened to Williamson and to James Byrne Warson, who certainly was sent to Coventry? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and stay safe, stay subscribed, ring the bell so you don't miss any upcoming episodes, and share this opus with anyone you please. If this is your first visit to my channel, please consider subscribing. My name is Warren, and I write and tell original ghost stories and original horror stories featuring such cryptids as the Night Floaters, werewolves, and the Black-Eyed Children. So again, please consider subscribing. Till midnight, cheers! Text of the stories read today, courtesy of Project Gutenberg. Pictures used in the video, courtesy of Pix Here, PX Here. The music was Haunted by Screams by the wonderfully talented Mayu.